This is how we remember the First World War. A war dominated by years of fighting, across hundreds of miles of trenches. But on the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, virtually no one predicted the bloody stalemate that was coming. This conflict, it was famously claimed, would be over by Christmas. It was supposed to be fought in rapid set-piece battles with lines of infantry, and still vital to all armies, mounted cavalry.
In August 1914, the cavalry still played a very important role, and yet 8 weeks later, these men are dismounted, they're in makeshift trenches, being used as stopgap infantrymen.
It was the end for traditional warfare. Soldiers would now die in their millions on the Western Front. The disaster is routinely blamed on the mistakes of unimaginative generals. But recent research points to another cause, a chance combination of new technology.
One of the real tragedies about the First World War was its timing. If it had taken place 20 years earlier, well, it would have been bloody, but not as bloody. And if we look forward 20 years later, more advanced technology meant that the Second World War was never deadlocked in the way that the First World War was.
Within 8 weeks in the First World War, inventors, including a French sweetmaker, an American cowboy, and a designer of fairground rides, changed warfare forever. When the German army attacked Belgium in early August 1914, Britain immediately declared war on the aggressor and joined on the side of France. 100,000-strong British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was mobilized. But as the Allies moved into Belgium, incredible reports of the size of the oncoming German army reached British High Command. To gather intelligence, cavalry reconnaissance patrols were urgently dispatched. One of these was about to be involved in the first British action of the Western Front. It's a little-known story that has been brought to light by oral historian Richard van Emden.
I was fascinated to find out how the First World War started, the very first action. And it was through a cavalry regiment, the 4th Dragoon Guards, that I discovered a war that appeared to come from a bygone age. It was an old-fashioned style of fighting, horses and cavalrymen, which within 2 months had gone forever.
To understand how their war changed into a trench battle, Richard has used first-hand accounts from the 4th Dragoon Guards. C Squadron was led by Major Tom Bridges and Captain Charles Hornby. As they stopped for the night on the 21st of August, their men were on high alert.
This is the main road to Brussels. On the 22nd of August 1914, C Squadron and the 4th Dragoon Guards were roughly where we're standing now. There have been reports that about 2,500 Germans were in the area, and it was their job to try and make contact. At about 6:30 in the morning, 4 German horsemen were seen to advance down the road, and a plot was hatched to try and catch them.
Secondary, mount! Quickly!
Captain Hornby took the 1st Trooper C Squadron and went off in hot pursuit.
The First World War opened with a traditional cavalry charge. It was the most dramatic thing that had ever happened to 16-year-old Private Ben Clouting.
The rest of the squadron followed on in support with drawn swords. Everyone was highly excited.
The 4th Dragoon Guards pursued the Germans for over a mile, into the small village of Casteau.
The Dragoons caught up with the Germans in the hollow just behind us here, and a fight broke out. It was the Dragoons' swords against the Germans' lances. It's recorded that Hornby took on a German on the right-hand side of the road here and drove his sword through him. Several others were down, possibly as many as 8, 6, 7 of whom were probably killed. The remainder of the Germans, realising there was no hope for them, turned and fled back up the road.
Hornby returned triumphant, his sword wet with the first German blood.
The Brigadier desires to congratulate the 4th Dragoon Guards on the spirited action of the troops on reconnaissance, which resulted in establishing the moral superiority of our cavalry from the first over the German cavalry.
This is the memorial commemorating that first skirmish. It seems incredible now that less than 90 years ago, you've got men fighting on horseback, the British with swords, the Germans with lances.
On the face of it, this was a dashing victory, won in classical style. But the mission's real significance was that it revealed the first hint of a very different conflict to come. For a start, the German prisoners they had taken were not the professionals the British had expected. The cavalry's medical officer remarked.
Bavarian ploughboys in German uniforms. That was all they really were. They had, they said, been called up for military training only a few weeks before the war broke out.
This could explain the German army's size. They had, in fact, called up millions of reservists and pushed them straight into the front line. Major Bridges' evidence suggested nearly 500,000 were coming towards the BEF alone. But British High Command couldn't believe it.
The information which you have acquired...
The information which you have acquired and conveyed to the Commander-in-Chief appears to be somewhat exaggerated.
It seemed impossible that the Germans could move so many troops so rapidly. To military historian Dr. Gary Sheffield, this marks the beginning of a new form of warfare, where the most valuable asset would be industrial muscle. And the key to this terrifying invasion was the railway.
The Germans came to believe that their only chance of victory was to strike against the French and knock them out of the war rapidly and redeploy millions of men across Germany using their strategic railway network to take on the advancing Russians. And it was this same strategic railway network which enabled the Germans to move vast forces into France and Belgium in August 1914.
Beginning of the 20th century, railways, the symbol of industrial progress, covered the globe. They brought rapid trade, commuting, mass migration, and the trip to the seaside. And they were about to make a huge impact on warfare. In August 1914, holidaymakers in England and France had to make way for armies as they travelled to the front. But it was the Germans who made the most efficient use of the railway. Their domestic network had been designed as an instrument of war, for carrying troops to the borders. Few of the original structures remained. But this deserted German rail depot in the border town of Metz, now part of France, shows the principle. It's connected to the rail system and next to huge barracks. In the first 2 weeks of August, around 11,000 trains took 5 million German troops to war. Industry had revolutionized the preparations for war. Now the impact of new technology would be felt on the battlefield. Unaware of the size or whereabouts of its foe, the British Army formed a thin 20-mile front around the town of Mons and waited for its first battle in Western Europe since Waterloo, 99 years before. One of the most vulnerable positions, the canal at Nîmes, was guarded by the Royal Fusiliers. As dawn broke on August the 23rd, a thick mist hung over the water.
The Fusiliers would have seen, as the mist cleared, dense waves of German troops emerging from those buildings. The British were very heavily outnumbered, but they had a major advantage.
Accurate at 600 yards, the Lee Enfield rifle was the fastest bolt-action rifle in the world. The Army still maintains a few at its small arms collection near Salisbury Plain. Soldiers in the BEF could fire up to 25 aimed shots a minute. And they would give the Germans a fight they weren't expecting.
I shall not easily forget the overture of that extraordinary battle. A crackling sound exactly like the noise of an October bonfire, into which a cartload of dry holly boughs has been suddenly thrown.
Marching in traditional infantry lines, the inexperienced Germans were unprepared for such murderous modern firepower. That day, the Germans lost 6,000 men against 1,600 British. But in the end, the sheer size of the German army made it irresistible.
By early afternoon, it was clear the Fusiliers were in danger of being overwhelmed, and they had to fall back. But I think retreat would have been impossible without a weapon that the British were using for just about the first time in European warfare, a weapon that was to have a major influence on all the battles fought on the Western Front.
This decisive weapon was the brainchild of Hiram Maxim. He was already inventor of a treatment for bronchitis, the electric chandelier, even an experimental aircraft. And this. Built in 1904, Sir Hiram Maxim's captive flying machine is still operating today on Blackpool Pleasure Beach. But Maxim craved one really big money spinner. An American friend advised him.
If you want to make your fortune and pile up gold by the ton, invent a killing machine that will let these Europeans cut each other's throats more easily. That's what they want.
So in 1884, Maxim produced the world's first fully automatic machine gun. The brilliance of its design lay in harnessing recoil energy, the kick felt in the shoulder when a rifle is fired. Instead of being a nuisance, in Maxim's gun this energy was used to fire the next round. No effort was needed, just the press of a button. Maxim sold across the world, and one of the most enthusiastic customers was the German army. By 1912, the Vickers Company had developed the Maxim into a lighter, more reliable gun, the Vickers .303. This gun fired 10 rounds every second. The phrase, "give them the full 9 yards," was a reference to the length of a vicar's ammo belt. For devising such an efficient killing machine, Maxim was knighted. And in 1914 at Mons, the lives of the Royal Fusiliers would depend on a single vicar's.
It was from this position here that the machine gun section of the 4th Royal Fusiliers covered the retreat of the rest of the battalion. These men could have been under no illusion what their job was, to sacrifice themselves to allow their comrades to get away.
Lieutenant Morris Dees held the Germans off for several hours before he was killed. Private Sidney Godley took over until he ran out of ammunition, throwing the gun into the canal before being captured. For their bravery, they were awarded the first 2 Victoria Crosses of the war.
It was testimony to the sheer firepower that a machine gun could produce that a small group of men could hold off vastly superior numbers of Germans coming across the canal.
The machine gun handed a big advantage to the defender. But in the face of cavalry attack, another much more benign invention would make defences almost unassailable. An invention that would come to symbolise the battles of the Western Front. It was an idea born of a serious problem for America's farmers. In the 1860s, the Great Plains of the Wild West were just a bit too wild.
When the settlers first arrived on the Great Plains, they found vast expanses of grasslands with no barriers. There was very little wood or stone available with which to build conventional fencing. But in about 1871, Joseph Glidden, who was a farmer and businessman from DeKalb, Illinois, found the solution.
Just off Route 66 in Texas, Delbert True helped to found the Devil's Rope Museum. It now houses the world's most comprehensive collection of barbed wire.
This is similar to the technique that Joseph Glidden used to make his first wire. We attach barbs by twisting wire around the wire. Then you cut it to length. Then you attach the barbed wire to a twisting device along with the smooth wire. Then you twist. And when you twist, this is the result.
Glidden's simple but ingenious idea was soon being mass-produced on an industrial scale. And before long, it aroused the interest of military planners, who upgraded it.
This wire was very vicious in nature and used during World War I. The barbs were closely spaced together, very sharp in nature. They did not turn, and it was very durable and hard for troops to cut. It slowed the troops right down, and it stopped the cavalry in its tracks.
After defeat at Mons, the British Expeditionary Force now had to fight its way out of Belgium. On its tail, a huge and vengeful German army. The cavalry of the 4th Dragoon Guards were about to experience the reality of charging into modern firepower and barbed wire.
About 11 o'clock on the 24th of August 1914, great hordes of Germans were seen to advance from that village on the horizon over there and pour across these fields. They threatened to envelop and perhaps even surround the BEF. a desperate holding action was needed, and 2 regiments of cavalry, the 4th Dragoon Guards and the 9th Lancers, were sent forward. They advanced up this road, the 9th Lancers to the right, the 4th Dragoon Guards to the left, possibly 800 in number, an incredible sight.
It was a desperate move to prevent the British from being surrounded.
It was a proper melee, with shell, machine gun and rifle fire forming a terrific barrage of noise. Dense volumes of dust making it impossible to see beyond the man in front. We were galloping into carnage, for nobody knew what we were supposed to be doing. All around me, horses and men were plummeting forwards as a machine gunner caught them with a burst of fire.
The 4th Dragoon Guards scrambled for a way through.
The troopers who had so far survived this desperate charge reached this point here, a sugar factory, the outside wall of which survives to this day. But they had a problem. There was a barbed wire fence, standing roughly where the fence line is now. They hadn't got a chance. They were riding up and down with nowhere to go. The men recalled riding along here in desperation, not knowing what to do.
Ahead, the leading troops were brought up by agricultural barbed wire when I heard a bugle sounding. Troops wheel right.
Left behind were 250 cavalrymen, dead, wounded, or taken prisoner.
This may have seemed like a desperate and futile charge, but the Dragoons and Lancers had done their job. They'd stopped the enemy advance.
The BEF were now in full retreat. As the infantry marched, they would rely again and again on the mobile cavalry to keep the enemy at bay.
We must delay the enemy's advance at all costs. From flank to flank, from dawn almost to dawn, across an embattled front, our cavalry rode throughout that retreat. From hour to hour, we hung on till the last desperate minute, while the crawling infantry got clear.
After 2 weeks of retreat, the exhausted Allies reached the outskirts of Paris. The Germans planned to surround the capital, but now they too were becoming stretched.
As the Germans advanced, their supply lines grew ever longer, and then they took the fatal gamble of wheeling their armies in front of Paris rather than taking the long way round. With this, the Allies saw their opportunity. They launched a counterattack, which became known as the Battle of the Marne. This counterattack so disconcerted the German command that they ordered a retreat.
As the German army retreated beyond the River Aisne, they destroyed bridges. One of the last remaining was over a canal at Bourg.
Germans are probably advancing.
On the 13th of September 1914, the 4th Dragoon Guards arrived at the south side of the canal on a mission to take the bridge. They knew it would be risky.
Here, at the village of Borg, the Germans had a strong position. A machine gun post, probably located in that house over there, defended the bridge, along with several sentries here. If the 4th Dragoon Guards were to take this bridge, they had to do it in a rush, and they were sent forward with machine gun fire covering their attack, as well as artillery fire.
They had to hope this fire would neutralize the German machine gun, and that there would be no barbed wire. It sounds like suicide, but the cavalry's speed and aggression terrified the enemy. Led by Captain Sewell, the 4th Dragoon Guards charged the bridge, scattering and killing Germans. But at the moment of victory, several cavalrymen were shot dead, probably by a sniper in the church tower. One of them, Captain Pat Fitzgerald, had been married just 3 days before he left for war. Despite the tragedy, Major Tom Bridges remarked,
"He has been lucky. Death in the moment of victory. Thousands will envy him before this war is over."
The 4th Dragoon Guards' dramatic assault on Bourg Bridge would be their last mounted attack before the war took a dramatic turn. At the end of that exhausting day, the cavalry got what appeared to be a rare opportunity to relax.
That night we spent in the Chateau of Soupir. Good dinner and some excellent Burgundy. But the evening was marred by the opening of heavy howitzer fire on our comfortable billet.
The elegant Chateau de Soupir was about to be reduced to a memory. All that remains today are a gatehouse and a few entranceways. The bombardment signaled a change in German tactics. They'd stopped retreating and had pulled up heavy guns in support.
The British Army's first experience of really heavy, sustained and rapid artillery fire came here on the Aisne during the fighting in September 1914. And this was a taster of things to come, because the Western Front was to be dominated above all by artillery. And gunnery had been revolutionised by a French invention of the late 19th century, which made artillery fire more rapid and more lethal than ever before.
This is the French 75mm gun, the last complete surviving piece from the First World War, and still maintained for the sake of tradition by the French artillery. Today, it fires only blanks. The rapid action of its breech allowed up to 24 shells to be fired every minute. But it had a more significant advantage. Previously, recoil had been a huge problem for the artillery. Guns jolted backwards as they fired, losing alignment with the target. So after each shot, the whole gun had to be reset. But with the 75, a hydraulic system meant only the barrel moved, returning each time to exactly the same position. Now targets could be rapidly shelled with merciless precision. The principle was soon used in heavier guns and howitzers. The Germans manufactured thousands. From concealed positions, they could pound distant targets with massive shells.
We began to get accustomed to the long moan, changing to a whine, then to a scream, then the volcano-like eruptions. Methodically, the German gunners would search for us, creeping ever nearer and nearer until whole valleys were pockmarked with smoking craters.
High Command pressed for a response to this annihilating force.
The Commander-in-Chief wishes the line now held by the Army to be strongly entrenched, and it is his intention to assume a general offensive at the first opportunity.
These shallow trenches were intended to be only a temporary measure. They were a base from which to launch the next attack. Today, those first offences are unmarked and practically forgotten. But with the help of a First World War British officer's map, Gary and Richard hope to find their location. They're searching for signs of an old landmark, a crucifix without a head that once stood on the German lines.
Just looking at this road here, it looks like we're coming to a natural fork, and this is the only one we've seen, which is shown on the map here as well.
I think you're probably right, actually. Well, if this map is to be believed, there should be a crucifix or something here.
Well, there's a bit of
things lying around.
Stone.
A couple of road signs.
Yeah.
What's this here? Oh, look. This is obviously the base of something. And I've seen French crucifixes on the Somme, which were built up like that.
Well, look, there's a lot more stone here. This is, So there's a crucifix, you think it might have been just sort of shoved over, and this is the original base?
I think so. They obviously never rebuilt it.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think that must be right in that case. So if I turn the map the other way up, so we're now actually standing on the crucifix. So the lines run across the field, sweep just in front of us, and bear off across that field. In that case, those are the British positions on the tree line. We've got a German machine gunner's eye view of the British trenches.
In search of the British lines, Gary and Richard cross no man's land.
Any signs?
Wow, look at this.
What do you think? Well, it's in the right place, according to the map.
Yeah, Gary, look at this. You've got that natural sort of zigzag.
Yep, the stone put parallels in. Yeah.
I mean, it's been softened with time, but it's clearly discernible, isn't it?
It is, yeah. That's as far as the British Army got in September 1914.
Wonderful.
I think this gives a very good impression of what it must have been like when the stalemate first began. After all, it's little more than a scrape in the ground, and yet men were sheltering from the terrifying bombardment of the German artillery. Walking over a ploughed field in Wellies gives some idea what it must have been like wearing full pack and a rifle.
Look at them.
90 years later, the soil is still full of evidence.
Oh, that's something big.
Well, they were firing them in this direction, so...
Yeah, it's certainly very large.
Yeah.
In mid-September 1914, with both sides pouring in men and weaponry, it seemed impossible that these fragile lines would remain fixed for long. And they couldn't have done, had it not been for a handful of unlikely and apparently unrelated inventions. Over a century before, Napoleon's army had been devastated by food shortages. The incident prompted French sweetmaker Nicolas Appert to embark on a series of experiments. He made an incredible discovery. By sealing food in an airtight canister, then heating it remained edible for years. Appert's original experiments have been recreated by food scientist Dr. Stuart Thorne.
The jars around me I've made according to Appert's recipe, including one that I have here, which I made 30 years ago and which has been on my office windowsill ever since. It's carrots, and they do appear to be in quite good condition. I think had we not killed all the bacteria in the jar by heating it adequately, the carrots would have deteriorated into a mush by now, and perhaps they'd have produced enough gas to destroy the jar. But I think now is the time to open it for you. They're a little bit discoloured, I think, from sitting in the light on an office windowsill for 30 years. They may not look too appetising, but I'm sure that if you ate them, they wouldn't poison you. I don't think I'm going to bother to eat them for you, though.
Appert's new way of preserving food in glass canisters became known as canning. But glass wasn't the most robust material for war, and the process was expensive. So a British invention, the tin canister, took over, and by the end of the century, canning was fully automated. Far away, the great cattle plains of South America fed canning plants on the coast. A favourite recipe was beef heated with nuggets or corns of salt. Corned beef was exported in millions of tons to America and Europe through ports such as Frei Bentos in Uruguay.
This, then, is the absolute classic of trench warfare, bully beef, corned beef. The French would trade for it, often for wine, for the British soldiers, and they had a nickname for this as well, that the French call this singe. My accent isn't very good, but it's monkey, which gives you some idea what they actually thought of it. This is McConaughey's, normally beef and vegetables or beans and pork. Soldiers ate it hot if they could possibly manage it, cold otherwise in a real emergency, and they always called it the same thing. They called it dog vomit.
McConaughey. Well, that's right. Oh, hey, McConaughey.
Now the winter is coming on, it's a bit nippy. Our regiment has lost a lot of men. The food known as bully stew is the same day after day after day. Little wonder that chicken stealing from local farms has become rife. I've proved quite a dab hand at it.
But the tin can meant that now the army could stockpile food, just like it did ammunition.
But once the tinning process comes in, once you can have preserved food available all year round, boring though it might be, you can keep the men in the trenches, you can keep them in contact with the enemy without having to do what was done historically, which is go into winter quarters to stop fighting during the winter season. For the first time, we can sustain our soldiers throughout the entire year, summer or winter, and the soldiers themselves will, if not thrive, at least they'll survive and be able to fight when they're asked to.
Thanks to food preservation, there need be no let-up in the fighting. But one development, more than any other, would make it difficult for either side to break the deadlock.
Until about 40 years before 1914, armies were commanded by generals on horseback. But in the First World War, armies were too big and too dispersed for this to be realistic. How were generals to send their orders to the front line and get information back again? This was an enormous problem during the First World War.
But there was a new weapon. On March the 6th, 1874, Alexander Graham Bell surprised his assistant in the next room with the words, "Come here, Mr. Watson, I want you." His invention captivated the world. By the beginning of the First World War, there were 10 million phones in use. While the army did hang on to its flags, runners, and even pigeons, the telephone offered major advantages.
Well, the kind of telephones that we were using at the start of World War I were this kind of beast here, which was actually the Mark III telephone. The procedure was to connect your telephones by line to telephone exchanges, rather like this one here. This one actually takes 10. Therefore, if you're a divisional commander, you could talk to any other 9 commanders within your division. So that becomes then a very, very useful tool indeed.
Attention.
Return to reserve trench. Is that you? Come in.
Now the war could be safely run from a desk behind the lines. The telephone became the trigger of the Western Front, and it allowed weaknesses in defence to be plugged immediately.
You're talking about, for instance, massive amounts of artillery shells, all of which has to be demanded when it's been expended. You're talking about massive combat supplies of food, of clothing, of water. And that was really what the telephone was able to sustain in World War I.
The telephone may have been perfect for defending, but it was virtually useless in attack. It was very difficult to take over the top. Without an effective means of communication, attackers were often forced to pull back. The consequences, very high casualties for very little gain. Incapable of breaking through, both armies began digging as fast as they could in an attempt to outflank each other. But the result was only longer trenches. By mid-October 1914, trench lines had reached the Alps in the south and the English Channel in the north.
The Germans were pressing rapidly towards the coast. Boulogne, we heard, had been already abandoned in panic. So we raced on north through chill October days.
Just 2 months after their first mounted action, the cavalry of the 4th Dragoon Guards were deployed to fight in trenches like these preserved near the Belgian town of Ypres.
In late October 1914, we find the 4th Dragoon Guards dismounted, serving in trenches, just like infantrymen. They're serving in places like Plug Street Wood, the Messines Ridge. It's tough, arduous fighting. A lot of them come down with exposure. The casualties are very heavy. At this time, Captain Hornby, the officer who inflicted the first casualty on the German army by the British, is seriously wounded. That's the end of his military career. The rest of the men soldier on. Most of them will not see their horses again for 3 years.
On October the 31st, 1914, they got their harshest experience yet, as the Germans made a massive push at the First Battle of Ypres.
The Germans kept pooping away with rifles, coming very close under the smoke. So we began to wonder how to fix the bloody bayonets which we'd been issued with 2 days previously.
Step up, lads.
It was a very trying day for the men. They were damned hungry, cold. We kept seeing wounded men coming hopping back, bleeding, howling.
In that grim battle, the Germans threw everything at the British trenches. But the line barely moved.
Trench warfare began through a combination of high technology, machine guns and artillery, and low technology, the Mark I Spade. Now, this combination of weapons and trenches put the defender in an incredibly strong situation. So it took over 3 years to find a way of breaking this trench deadlock.
By Christmas 1914, of the original 100,000 soldiers of the BEF, 90,000 were dead, missing, or wounded. But a 450-mile front of trenches had now been dug, and it all needed to be manned. In Britain, a massive army of volunteers and later conscripts was recruited. Eventually, over 5 million would fight on the Western Front. Now the size of the army was far beyond anything in British military history. So dangerous was it to venture beyond the trenches of Ypres that it was often impossible to rescue the injured.
Men wounded and caught in the wire had hung out for days in the cold rain and died more of exposure than wounds, after being in some cases partly eaten alive by rats.
Death was now so commonplace that rotting corpses were sometimes left to decay in the trenches.
In one place the head of a lancer protruded, and not far off the stockinged, gangrenous leg of a Highlander. But it was often inadvisable in such narrow trenches to remove the bodies. Prizing them up seemed to suck in the semi-liquid foundation of the walls.
There has been no war quite like it, before or since. After a 3-year-long bloody learning curve, the deadlock was finally broken by new tactics. The Allies hit the German lines with an artillery barrage that would gradually creep forward, precisely choreographed with advancing infantry and tanks. In August 1918, for the last time, the cavalry of the 4th Dragoon Guards remounted to help push the enemy back through Belgium.
This plaque marks the spot where Allied troops arrived as the armistice came into force. It's an interesting coincidence that barely 30 yards away we have the memorial commemorating the first skirmish of the 4th Dragoon Guards barely 4 years before. 3 weeks later, after the armistice, the 4th Dragoon Guards were given the honour of leading the Allied troops into Germany as part of the occupying force.
The 4th Dragoon Guards entered the German city of Cologne on December the 6th, 1918. Their triumphant parade marked the end of the First World War. A war that has become infamous for its senseless stalemate and lack of imagination by military leaders. Yet ironically, the truth is that these soldiers were casualties of the biggest military revolution in history.
Take a rare visit inside isolated and repressive North Korea, where a cult of personality is perpetuated by its dictator. Welcome to North Korea is next.